Thanks so much, Amy. Thank you everyone for coming on this lovely warm evening. Very nice to see some familiar faces and some new names as well. I'm Lisa, I'm one of the co-founders, as Amy said, and I am like super excited about this evening. I feel like super excited is like a really overused phrase, but I am actually a bit of a girl fan of Sophie's. So her work's incredible, feeling very grateful that she's agreed to come this evening and share her story and her work with us all, because it's really inspiring. Just to backtrack a little bit, I first met Sophie when she was giving a keynote talk at the Beyond conference in Cardiff last year, which we were invited to be on a panel there. And the conference is really about broader kind of creative industries and how we're moving towards sort of creating the future. And it was really fascinating to see how people outside of our industry and in broader fields were looking at futures and imagination and embedding that in their work. And obviously Sophie at a country level, sort of, that blew my mind. I'd only really thought about it in the construct of what we were doing, and so to see all these different levels was amazing. So just a bit of a background on the Good Life 2030 project for those of you who aren't familiar with it. Obviously, that project is all about co-creating an alternative vision for the future. So using creativity and imagination to step towards a new model for our industry. So it looks at kind of the industry, it looks at the work, it looks at society, and tries to kind of help us reimagine how we can move towards a different place that supports a thriving future for all. Began in 2021 with COP26 on the horizon, feels like a million years ago now, with deep research with a broad group of UK citizens to understand what they dream of when they think about 2030. So when we did this research, it became super clear that the dreams people hold about the future are really about more connection, not more consumption. We can share links to the citizen vision reports with you. These insights from the citizen vision work have then sort of developed into two tracks of work for the Good Life 2030 project. So the first is a creative brief where the future is the client and the client has an image problem, and over 700 creatives have now responded to this brief, including big advertising agencies. We launched a campaign at Piccadilly Circus on Earth Day, but also supported by creative communities and universities. So lots of people creating new visions of the future that we can move towards today. The second track of that is all about business models. So how we can reimagine advertising towards a thriving future. And within that sort of line of work, over 200 industry leaders have taken part in imagination workshops to identify how we can go about reimagining the industry and what needs to change. So what shifts do we need to take in order to get there? And we're now embarking on a 6-month program, a learning journey with some of the people who came to the workshops. And we're really looking at what an alternative business model for the future could look like in our industry. We've also just packaged up the kind of exhibition and the workshops, and we're going to be sending something out tomorrow because we've decided that actually, given the demand, we should probably take this on the road and into agencies. So if that's something that's interesting, then get in touch. Anyway, enough about us. I am super delighted to introduce Sophie Howe, who is here for our second Disruptor Session. So Sophie was the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales, the only role of its kind in the world. She held Welsh government to account to shape how their decisions affect future generations, and has influenced other countries and institutions to follow suit, including the UN. So named as one of the UK's top 100 changemakers and at number 5 in the BBC Women's Power list, she is not afraid to call out the madness of short-term decision-making and is known for being a straight-talking and inspirational advocate for those yet to be born. She is now working with corporations and governments across the world, advising them on how they can do something similar. So her ability to reimagine a new future and set a clear vision and build a pathway for an entire country to come on board has resulted in outstanding progress in Welsh politics, including record investment in tackling climate change and a moratorium on road building, which is like mind-blowing. Sophie embodies the power of applying futures thinking and putting this into practice to improve future well-being for all. And I guess the thing for me is like there's so much we can learn from her work. So super excited to hand over to Sophie. Thank you for being with us, and over to you.
Oh, well, thank you, Lisa, and noswaith pawb. That's good evening in Welsh and Gymraeg. I'm actually in London, camping out in the Clerkenwell Design Festival. So there are lots of people around me, so I'm hoping the sound isn't too bad. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Bear with me a second. Hopefully you might be seeing my screen now. Have you got it? I can't see anyone. Yeah, perfect. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so yes, going back to what Lisa said, I suppose what we've been trying to do is you know, your purpose disruptors, and I count myself probably as a purpose disruptor, and I'm going to tell you the story of how we've sort of tried to positively disrupt the purpose of a whole country. As you heard, I was the first Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. I held that post for 7 years until January of this year. I came to the end of my 7-year term. And my job is to be the guardian of the interests of the future generations of Wales. So no pressure there. What does a Future Generations Commissioner do? Well, I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we get into the discussion. Some of it, of course, is, you know, thinking to the future and potentially trying, well, you can't predict the future and there is no one future, there's futures, but, you know, looking at future trend scenarios and so on. And sometimes actually it's looking to the past in terms of, you know, where we might have been able to predict things, where we might have got things wrong and so on. But I'm going to start with some quite amusing predictions back 100 years ago, what they were predicting might happen in 2023. So, you know, this is quite a good one. No more hard work, because due to electricity, we'll only be working a mere, I think it's 4 hours a day. As I said, owing to the work of electricity. So we're not quite there. Most of us still slugging a lot longer than that. And then you've got curls for men and women with black teeth. How very bizarre. Which cracks me up here. We should worry about this, apparently. And of course, life expectancy. So by 2023, the average life of a man could be increased to 100 years. In individual cases, it could be increased to 150 or perhaps 200 years. So we're not quite there, but, you know, again, some progress. And perhaps us all living longer is something to do with the utensils and dwellings made by pulp. Maybe that's the thing that is enabling us to live as long as that. But actually, when you look at those predictions, they seem quite bizarre. But there are kind of nods, if you like, to some of the things that we are encountering now. So there has been continuous growth actually until quite recently in life expectancy. Some worrying shifts at the moment in terms of life expectancy starting to plateau. I'm not going to comment on the political system here in the UK, but in the UK, life expectancy started to plateau in the last decade. I would say that that's probably a connection back to austerity, but we're seeing that. But nevertheless, before then, increases in life expectancy. We're starting to see this big debate around reduced working week. Most companies now adopting some form of flexible working. And some, you know, reducing the working week to 4 days and so on. Of course, we're seeing, you know, changes in our use of plastic, etc. In Wales, we're about to ban single-use plastic, and of course, there's lots of debate going on around gender and identity. So, although back 100 years ago they couldn't predict exactly, you know, what we would all be doing in 2023, there are some, you know, some things, some nuggets that you can pick there. In terms of what's happening now. But the challenge that we have, I guess, is that we are always working on an endemically short-sighted system, and a short-sighted system which often avoids looking and considering risk. So we often think that, you know, things kind of happen by surprise, and the pandemic, for example, happened by surprise, but actually, the risk of a global pandemic, and you can kind of see there, you know, some of those risks of infectious disease, those things are featured in the global risk register for actually for many years. And what is at number 1, 2, and 3 of the global risk registers at the moment? Well, it's all issues relating to kind of climate and nature. And so even though we know about those risks, and again, we can't predict exactly what the outcomes or what the effects of those risks will be, we know that they are pretty certain to happen, certainly in terms of climate and biodiversity loss. We are still kind of ignoring those risks and not doing anything near what we need to be doing to mitigate those risks or prevent them from escalating. And if you saw the report last week, you know, most scientists think that we've now completely gone beyond any chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. And there's something not just about our kind of whole system, but actually us as individuals, in terms of how our brains might be hardwired to ignore the future. So there was a study here done in 2009, and they looked at the brain activity of the participants of the study. So they asked them to consider someone completely, with no connection to them. And they also asked them to consider their future selves. And you can see here that actually the brain activity, when people were asked to consider someone, a complete stranger who had no connection to them, was very similar to the brain activity that they saw when they were asked to consider even their future selves. So there's something there about our brains being kind of hardwired to ignore the future. And this is why we ignore some of these kind of big challenges that haven't just sort of popped up recently, but actually have popped up or have, been developing over very many years. So we can see the increasing wealth inequality gap, the big challenges in terms of our economic system. And, there's often a situation where, whatever you might say, whatever question that you might pose, the answer to that question, the solution to that is do the thing that is going to make the most money. So I think our economic system is broken. You can see this here by this kind of wealth inequality gap. So the poorest half of the population, the bottom 50%, the middle 40% and the top 10%, how their incomes are increasing. I talked a little bit about life expectancy plateauing. These are some of the big challenges that are facing us in the future. And I said there, back to this graph on the right-hand side, that we started to see these kind of big plummets in around 2011, where austerity really started to kick in. So again, we know that this is a problem, and are we putting in place the right measures to think about that in the long term and act on that in the long term? And if we look at our whole system really and globally, what we might need to do in terms of future generations, well, if we look 50,000 years to the past, there have been about 100 billion people who were once alive and are now dead. This was from Roman Kusnarik's book, The Good Ancestor. I'd recommend it to you if you haven't read it. So slightly out of date, because our global population has now reached about 8 billion, but around about 8 billion living at the moment. But if we look at the scale of unborn generations, so those yet to be born based on current population trends in the next 50,000 years, there are likely to be born 6.75 trillion people in the next 50,000 years. So the 8 billion of us living at the moment, we talk about this kind of decade of delivery, and this decade where particularly the existential threat around climate change, we have a very small window to kind of keep that in check. What us 8 billion do, and actually of that 8 billion, really we're talking about a tiny, tiny proportion of decision makers, because although of course we all have a part to play in these, in changing our lifestyles, changing our behaviours, and so on, actually it is the big major global corporates, and it is government, public policy makers who are have the most power to affect how this 6.75 trillion people will live or not live in the future. And I've got a number of Gen Zs in my household, so I like to engage in a bit of hip hop. And so Loyal Kana, I don't know if you've heard of him. This This is an artist that my kids love to listen to, and I think that there are so many artists at the moment who are really calling out our current decision makers, and Loyal Kana hits it on the nail on the head here. Never has so much been lost by so many because of the indecision of so few, and that's essentially the reality of our public policy system, where we completely discount the interests of future generations. And Roman Ksnarik describes us almost as like colonizing future generations, casting them off to some distant colony that we don't actually have to think about. So in Wales, what are we doing differently? Well, in Wales, I don't know what you think of, or if you might have visited Wales. Our history and heritage has been one of coal mining. The first £1 million cheque for coal was signed here. This picture here is of the coal exchange back over 100 years ago, and then about 4 or 5 years ago. You can see some of the differences there. Certainly there are more women at least included in the second picture. But yeah, the first £1 million cheque for coal was signed here. Wales has this industrial heritage. We're also known, as a land of song, culture, heritage, as a land with beautiful natural landscapes and natural resources. But essentially, our industrial heritage has been doing not just a huge amount of damage to that, but also a huge amount of damage to other parts of the world. So we are determined that we were once at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution, and we are now going to be at the forefront of the low carbon revolution, which puts future generations into public policy making by law. So in 2015, we passed a groundbreaking piece of legislation called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that law does a number of things. So first off, it sets in law this overarching principle that all of our public bodies should seek to ensure that they meet today's needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, this act applies to the Welsh Government, all of our public bodies, our local authorities, our health boards, our national agencies like Public Health Wales, Natural Resources Wales, the Arts Council, and many more. So this is the overarching principle that they must demonstrate they're applying in their decision making. And it then sets out 7 long-term wellbeing goals. And I'm just going to go on to this. So these are the 7 long-term wellbeing goals, and these goals were devised in conversation with the citizens of Wales. So the Welsh Government held a national dialogue where it was called The Wales We Want, and they posed the question to the people of Wales: what is the Wales you want to leave behind to your children, your grandchildren, and future generations to come? And this enabled people to be in that space of, what is the art of the possible here? Also, what is really important to us? Not in terms of, what are we worried and concerned about now necessarily, because then you tend to get more of, I'm really fed up of sitting in congestion, or I can't get a doctor's appointment, or, in the here and now in 2023, I'm concerned about the cost of living crisis. Of course, all of those are real issues, but actually, if you take yourself out of the here and now and you say, what's important to leave behind to our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, people get into a whole different space. And the sorts of things that they talked about was they wanted Wales to be fairer. They really felt that there was, a huge importance in protecting our natural landscapes and our environment. They felt that our economy, it was important that we had a prosperous economy which developed decent jobs, not just any old jobs, but actually our economy needed to be set within the context of planetary boundaries. We felt that our culture, language, and heritage were important. We felt that we wanted a connection between and within our communities. So having had that conversation with the citizens of Wales, the Welsh Government, and looking at the kind of evidence in terms of some of the future trends and challenges and opportunities facing Wales, the Welsh Government developed these 7 wellbeing goals, which are set out in law, and all of our public institutions have duties to set objectives which maximise their contribution to all 7 of these wellbeing goals, and then to take all reasonable steps to meet them. And I really like this this quote, you've got to think about the big things while you're doing small things so that the small things go in the right direction. So that's essentially the framework that we've tried to set in Wales. Now, you wouldn't think it was revolutionary for a country to have a set of long-term goals or a vision, but it's completely revolutionary. Wales is the only country, I suppose, the only thing that kind of gets close to the Sustainable Development Goals, which are obviously global goals. And our Future Generations Act, I suppose, is our iteration of those Sustainable Development Goals. But it's crazy to think that Wales is the only country that has a vision, a long-term vision for a country set out in law. And therein, I suppose, lies the problem, because if I asked you what's the vision for the UK, you might have your own ideas of what that vision might be, but there's no agreed version of that. The only thing we've got to go by is, you know, what did we all vote for, or what did some of us vote for in the last election? And that's the manifesto by which the government are you know, setting their business and their policy priorities around. But that's essentially 5 years. And so it's no wonder really that we then see massive challenges in terms of nobody's been taking the climate crisis seriously, because it takes long-term interventions. Nobody's dealing with issues around an aging population. Nobody's anywhere near dealing with, you know, seizing the opportunities and avoiding the challenges or mitigating the challenges that AI and automation pose, or the future and how that might link to the future of work, or even potentially the future of humanity. Because quite frankly, I've only got to think about the next 5 years, and that's going to be someone else's problem. So that's why in Wales we've set this out, not just as something which, you know, is a sensible thing to do, but actually as a statutory duty. So the law also establishes then an independent Future Generations Commissioner, and that's important because you know, governments marking their own homework never ends particularly well. So my role here, as you can see set out here, general duties: promote the Sustainable Development Principle, act as the guardian of the ability of future generations to meet their needs, and so on. I've got lots of powers, duties, and functions, which you can see here set out in the Act on the left. In reality, what does this actually mean in terms of what a Future Generations Commissioner does? So I'm not part of government, I'm independent of government. My job is to hold government to account. Sometimes that means putting in place or proposing countrywide policy reforms in terms of what are the steps we could take to reach those long-term goals. A lot of times it's the really unsexy stuff of unpicking all the policies, systems, regulations which conflict with our public institutions, our services, and our policymakers taking a long-term view. Sometimes it's intervening in poor or bad policy decisions. I spent an inordinate amount of time, many of you might have worked either in government or around governments, this won't surprise you, but an inordinate amount of time introducing civil servants to each other, suggesting that, well, you know, over here, the housing minister has set a priority to build X thousand affordable homes. Well, over here in the skills department, maybe you need your skills plan to work out where we're going to get the skills to build those affordable homes. So this disconnection and silo-based mentality in government, and again, just looking at what's the demand in the here and now, rather than thinking what is coming down the track at us and how do we join up all of the levers of government to make sure we're prepared for that, either in terms of mitigating challenges, but in that case, actually making sure that we've got young people who have the necessary skills to be able to take up those opportunities of those new jobs that will be created. Here's a little bit about the infrastructure of the Future Generations Act. I won't sort of dwell on that for too long. And here is the other really important element of the Future Generations Act. So alongside that vision for the Wales that we want to leave behind, it also sets out 5 ways that our public bodies must now work in order to deliver that vision. So they must consider the long-term impact of the things they do, or even the things that they don't do. They must look at the long-term trends and scenarios affecting Wales. They must prevent problems from occurring or getting worse. They must integrate their actions. So this is this point around getting outside of their silos and recognising the connections between different policy areas, seizing the opportunities to make that policy deliver the maximum benefit across those wellbeing goals and avoiding any kind of conflicts in policies. They must collaborate with each other. And again, you know, I think this is a message for not just the public sector, but you know, everyone, because, you know, the world's challenges will not be solved by single heroic acts. You know, being heroic has its merits, but actually most things can only be achieved by us all working together. And across all sectors, you get these silos, which means we're missing opportunities, and we're only delivering at best a kind of linear solution to something, and at worst we're delivering a solution which might solve one problem and create a load of others. And then finally, involvement. So involving citizens in the decision-making process. So here, I just want to give a little bit of a kind of, you know, provocation around where some of those connections are. So, and why they're so important. So if we start from the perspective of health, you know, we all love our National Health Service. If you know, you can turn on the news or, you know, open your Twitter feed or whatever it might be any given day, and you will see something about the crisis in our healthcare system. You'll see the news reporting on the long waiting lists and so on and so on. Now, of course, those are all real life problems. The bigger problem, however, is that actually, if you look at the discrepancy in life expectancy, so what is it that, you know, keeps us well and living to a ripe old age, or living long and prospering, as Dr. Spock said, or what is it that means that we don't live to a ripe old age? What are the things that are the main factors in that? Actually, only 10% of that difference in life expectancy is anything to do with the healthcare system. Now, across the UK, we're spending about 50%, well, certainly in Wales, where, you know, it's different because the UK government have a different budgetary arrangement, but we're spending about 50% of our entire budget on our healthcare system, and it's already creaking and breaking. So that means that what we're doing is basically, we're just literally, it's not a national health service, it's a national illness service. We patch people up when they're ill. We never really get to the root cause. Where are the root causes? Well, the root causes, 35% of root causes of health and poor life expectancy is about income security and social protection. So poverty, you know, food poverty, have you got enough money to put food on the table, and so on. 29% relates to our living conditions. So what's the quality of your housing? Are you living in areas of high air pollution? Are you living in areas where you have access to nature and public open space? 19% is about social and human capital. So the quality of your relationships. Is there a sense of community in the area that you live? Do you feel that you have a sense of agency in that community? So when we talk about well-being, often people, you know, talk about the sort of, you know, think, oh, it's the soft and fluffy stuff that government shouldn't get involved in. And I was recently in Australia helping their government, their new Labour government, actually, who's committed to a wellbeing budget. And the previous sort of right-wing coalition had said to the new Chancellor who'd committed to doing this wellbeing budget, oh, the Chancellor's going to turn up and deliver his budget speech with yoga beads. And that can sometimes be the kind of narrative around wellbeing. But actually what we see here is that focus on wellbeing and, you know, social and human capital, your living conditions and so on, far from it being the soft and fluffy stuff, it's actually the stuff that relates back to the hard metrics of how long we are going to live. And that's why those connections are so important. And that's why having a legislation which requires us not just to think about, oh God, how are we going to plug the gap in the health service and how are we going to plough more money into the health service, that will never actually get to the root cause of health. We need to be looking in these other areas. So essentially what we're trying to do through this legislation in Wales is connect the wellbeing dots. And you can see here just some examples. So, you know, a universal basic income, which we are actually piloting in Wales, isn't just good for taking people out of poverty. It has that direct correlation to their life expectancy, and the healthier they are, the more prosperous a nation is, the better society is. If we think about some of the things about improving poverty, so we've got free school meals, we're having universal free school meals in Wales. That's brilliant. That helps to alleviate some poverty, but it also helps us to get a nutritious meal into our kids. And when we apply our Future Generations Act then also to the supply chain, procuring that meal, that food locally, supporting local farmers, and so on, that's not just giving tackling poverty, it's not just giving our kids a healthy meal, which is going to help to tackle the obesity crisis, it's also helping local regeneration and income for local farmers and reducing carbon emissions and so on. So we're really trying to look at where all of these things join up. And I quite like to use this model. It plays pretty well. And, if there are some of you who are, working on strategy for corporate organizations, this is called the 3 Horizons model. This is quite a useful thing, which often sort of turns a light bulb on with people. So if you look at Horizon 1, where are we going at the moment? Well, if we carry on with business as usual, there's a lot of things that are not going to be fit for the future. I mean, for a start, we're not going to have a planet to live on, so that's pretty catastrophic. If we look then at Horizon 3, this is where we want to be. Now, here's the trick in Wales. We want this to become the new normal, and here's the trick in Wales. We know where we want to be because we've got 7 long-term wellbeing goals set out in law. So everything we do should be seeking to get us towards those 7 wellbeing goals. Here, the blue line, Horizon 2, these are the sort of innovations in play, or the things, the actions that we need to take that are going to take us towards that new normal. Now, some of the things that we've got to think about there is, are those actions actually going to take us towards a new normal, or are they going to take us back to business as usual? So if I give the example of how this might play out, if we started from the point of, I'm someone who needs to, the country needs to decarbonise transport. 17% of our emissions come from transport, and so we need to decarbonise that. Absolutely, we do. Right, what's the quickest and most effective way of doing that? Well, mass rollout of electric vehicles. We'll give grants for electric vehicles. We'll really up our investment in EV infrastructure and so on. Now, that's all very well and good if your sole mission is to decarbonise transport, but actually that holistically just takes us back to business as usual, because we're all still sat in congestion in our electric cars, not our diesel or petrol cars. We're all still getting fatter and adding to the obesity crisis because we're driving everywhere and not using active travel or public transport. None of us are still talking to our neighbours or connecting with our communities because we're getting in our cars on our drives and driving off, adding to the congestion, and so on. And actually, if you're from a poorer community, you couldn't afford a petrol car, so it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to afford an EV, and so that means we're not addressing that goal of a more equal Wales. If you want to reach a new normal, which is a holistic new normal based on a vision that we have in Wales, then actually a much better investment is investing in public transport and active travel, which reduces emission, connects better in terms of accessibility for poorer communities, connects communities, and helps to improve our health. And that's exactly what we did in Wales. So the first big test of the legislation was a government proposal. It'd been on their books for quite some time. Government proposal to spend the entire of the Welsh Government borrowing capacity on building a new 13-mile stretch of motorway at the M4 around Newport to deal with congestion. Now, I don't know if any of you have been to or spent any time driving in America, but you will see there that their what do they call them, freeways, are started off at 3 lanes. I was on one in Texas, which was an 8-lane motorway. It started at 3. They added a lane, they added a lane, they added a lane, they added a lane. Because whenever we build bigger roads, basically we just fill them, because we continue to invest in building roads and we never actually invest in modal shifts, so providing an alternative. If you're based in London, of course, you're really lucky, but elsewhere in the country, public transport is pretty poor and woeful. So I intervened in that issue and I asked the government to justify to me how they'd applied the Future Generations Act to that decision. So as I explained in relation to the 3 horizons in the last slide, how they considered health, how they considered the goal of a prosperous Wales, which talks about a productive, innovative, low carbon society, how they considered the goal of a resilient Wales, which is about ecological resilience, enhancing, maintaining, restoring nature, how they'd applied the goal of more equal Wales. So essentially, an independent commissioner holding a mirror up to the government, asking them to justify how they'd applied their own legislation. So to cut a long story short, the government changed their minds. They cancelled the road. They set up a new commission with terms of reference built around delivering the goals of the Future Generations Act. And instead of this new road, the proposals are 6 new train stations, big investment in public transport and active travel. And since there, we have changed our entire transportation strategy. So we now have, here you can see private motor vehicles at the bottom of the transport hierarchy. I challenge the government on their spend, and every year I monitor their budget, how their budget is aligning to the wellbeing goals. So in the last 2 years, we've seen a shift in spending from 2/3 of our infrastructure investment budget being spent on roads to 1/3 of our budget being spent on roads. And more recently, we've effectively had a moratorium, a freeze on all road building projects because it doesn't align with the Future Generations Act. So this is essentially, you usually get this argument between economy versus environment, and whenever you get an argument of economy versus environment, economy always wins and environment always loses, except when you've got a legal framework to take different decisions, to force our governments to take different decisions. What are some of the other things that have happened as a result of the Act in Wales? So when cops do kindness, so we know that the vast majority of people who end up in our criminal justice system, they're not bad people, they're often sad people, they're people who've experienced trauma. So getting up front of that, looking at what are the things that result in people coming into our criminal justice system. We did a big piece of work looking at adverse childhood experiences. So these are kids who grow up in households where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health problems, and so on. And for those kids who grow up with 4 or more of those ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, they're 15 times more likely to end up in the criminal justice system. They're 16 times more likely to have used crack, cocaine or heroin. They are 6 times more likely to have an unintended teenage pregnancy. So actually, if we get up front of that and if we're able to identify the kids who've experienced these ACEs, then we can route them into early intervention. So thousands of our police officers across Wales have been trained in trauma-informed practice, and they are able to route these kids who are coming into the criminal justice system, or coming into the notice of police, if you like, into early intervention services. When a health system keeps people and planet well, so we have a public health consultant in Cardiff leading the development of our transportation strategy, and that has meant that doctors in Cardiff can prescribe free bike hire to patients rather than just issuing a prescription for statins or for antidepressants. Why is that good? It's good for people's health. It helps to reduce air pollution if we get more people travelling actively, and that's good for health. It reduces our carbon emissions and it reduces congestion on our roads. The first big hospital solar farm in Wales, again, looking at the connections between human and planetary health, because on the one hand, our health system is charged with the health of a nation. On the other hand, if the healthcare system was a country, it would be the 5th biggest emitter of carbon in the world. So on the one hand, it's trying to keep people well. On the other hand, it's responsible for one of the biggest threats to human health. So we need to decarbonise our healthcare system. A road to a universal basic income. So when a country gets to the root cause of poor health, of poor educational attainment, of breakdown in communities. And okay, it's only a pilot and we're going to see how that pans out, and it will be expensive to deliver a universal basic income, but not as expensive as picking up the pieces later. So Wales now has the first government-backed pilot of a UBI in the UK. Really interesting stuff here around the difference that, or the different type of thinking that's happening in our civil service. So we set an aspiration to be a zero waste nation by 2050. Wales is already third in the world for its rates of recycling. But if we want to become a zero waste nation, thinking about that kind of 3 horizons model that I showed you, how would you reach the zero waste whilst also addressing a number of our other wellbeing goals? So in Wales, we're investing in the library of things where people can come together and borrow lawnmowers and paint strippers and all of these things that we might keep in our sheds or garages or attics or what have you, that we might use only once a year. It's good to bring communities together to do that. It means if we're sharing, we're not, using the resources to actually produce, and it's fewer things ending up in landfill. Likewise, community repair cafes, where people can come and get their phones, microwaves, TVs, whatever it might be, repaired by volunteers, helps to tackle poverty, helps to reduce waste, helps to connect communities. And here are some of the examples of some of the things that those kind of the library of things is achieving. So almost 15,000 just in one of our libraries, 15,000 kilograms of carbon, £102,000 saved by the community from borrowing rather than buying. This is one as a mum of 5. My eldest is 23, my youngest is 9. So I have seen firsthand the reforms or the outcomes of the reform in our school curriculum that have happened as a result of the Future Generations Act. So we have a new curriculum in Wales based around the Future Generations Act with these 4 purposes: healthy and confident individuals, enterprising and creative contributors, ambitious and capable learners. Our curriculum is formed on what are the skills that our young people are going to need in the future, yes, to enable them to get the jobs of the future, but actually for them to have a life well lived and actually to be ethical contributors to society. So imagine if every one of us had been through a school system that taught us to be ethical and informed citizens. Would we be in the middle of a climate crisis? Perhaps we wouldn't be. And the next iteration of that is the potential to scrap GCSEs. So we're consulting at the moment on reforms to GCSEs, because testing kids on the basis of the knowledge they can regurgitate in a 2-hour exam is complete nonsense, when the skills we need them to have are empathy, teamwork, collaboration, critical thinking. And actually we need to equip them to have good mental and physical health and so on. And that doesn't happen through a 2-hour exam. And our act has gone beyond just the public sector. It applies only to the public sector. But what we found is that when we've created this long-term vision for a country, actually you get people and organisations outside of the public sector saying, we actually like the fact that the country has a long-term vision. How can we get behind it? So some of you might be into football and might know that last year Wales, for the first time in 64 years, went to the World Cup. What happened the week before they went? We launched with the FAW, the Football Association of Wales, their first sustainability and wellbeing strategy, Wales Wellbeing in the World, with an aim to make them the most sustainable football association in the world. And what are some of the things that are happening as a result of that? There's tree planting going on. There's looking at ways in which we can get parents physically active whilst they're watching their kids on the sidelines. One of the first big things was equal pay between the male and female teams, because each of those areas and many, many more are contributing to those 7 wellbeing goals. And here, I suppose, is some of the things that are happening as a result of the Future Generations Act globally. So we've been pushing the agenda and lessons from Wales. So there's going to be a bill in Scotland, a commitment from the SNP. There was a UK Future Generations bill led by Lord Bird here. It fell because private members' bills are very, very difficult to get through. But there's a real opportunity now in the run-up to the next UK government elections to really get this back on the agenda. Ed Miliband, who's the Shadow Environment Secretary, has written about the Future Generations Act in his book. It's called Go Big. And it's seen as a kind of, potential menu of manifesto ideas for the next Labour government. And he is proposing a Future Generations bill for the UK, which would be incredibly exciting. So just a few lessons on the things that I've learned before I wrap up. It's not been easy, and I've been met with a lot of people who I call the abominable no men. So these are the people who say it can't possibly be done, it's all too difficult, or they're the people who pretend that they're doing things. They write their new strategies and plans using the well-being and future generations words, but don't actually do anything different. And that's where having a commissioner to sort of push them and challenge them and critique what they're doing and call them out if they're not doing the right things is really, really important. We also see these people, the kind of passive procrastinators, the people who are going, well, I don't really know what the future is going to hold, and we can't really predict it, and I don't really know what the new technology advances might be for tackling climate change, and I'm a bit unsure about this, that and the other, so I shall sit and do nothing until someone else goes first. We really need to be challenging those people, and these are the people I think who are certainly starting to challenge them in Wales. So these frustrated champions, and I wouldn't mind betting if you're on this call, you are probably one of these frustrated champions. So these people who've been able to see for a long time that there's a better way of doing things, but the system frustrates them. So I'm sure you will see that in the world of advertising and marketing, some of the madness perhaps of the outcomes that you're trying to generate, or your companies are trying to generate, produce more stuff for people to consume, to use more resources, to add to climate change, and so on. These people in our system, the Future Generations Act is giving them permission to challenge the system, because what they're able to do is to wave a piece of law at the abominable no man and say, you may not want to do it, but actually you have a statutory duty to. And it's those people who we've identified very early on, and they were relatively small in number at the beginning of my 7-year term. And at the end of my term, I made awards to 100 changemakers across Wales. I could have had thousands and thousands of them, because once you create an environment and a permissive legislative framework for people to do different and better things, and you inspire them behind a vision, magic starts to happen. So I'll just end with this bit of advice from Einstein: great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. I'd add into that, and systems, but you must keep going. So thank you.
That was amazing. Wow.
I'm just going to try and get back on and stop sharing. There we go.
Oh, Sophie, that was so brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm sure so many people got so much out of that. Lisa, I think you were going to just share some reflections, that perhaps was that.
I think that was, just so much. To be able to kind of think about this at such a sort of holistic level, and like kind of to go between sort of, I don't know, education to life expectancy to transport to sort of, it's got so many things sort of buzzing in my brain. Thank you, Sophie. I will kind of share some thoughts, I guess, and if you've got questions, continue to drop them in the document. We're going to come back to those in a second. I guess first of all, it would be good to just see how that made people feel, which is something we always like to do at Purpose Disruptors. Thank you. Frustrated yet inspired. So 1 to 3 words like in the chat would be great, just to get a sense of the level of sort of like the vibe in the room on the Zoom. Hopeful. Okay. Yeah, energized and hopeful. Oh, these are great. Yeah. Sophie for PM, that's my favorite one. Absolutely. Oh my God, can you imagine how different the country would be? I'm
too chopsy. That's a Welsh word for
no,
choppy and feisty.
Chopsy and feisty is exactly what we need in the UK. Oh my word, that would be amazing. Thank you. Yeah, a new future is possible. Yeah, that's exactly how I felt sort of listening to this. It's super inspiring. I wanted to just circle back to a couple of things that jumped out for me in terms of, both listening and thinking about the work that we're trying to do and what the kind of connective tissue is. The challenge of working on in a short-sighted system, like very similar to ours, like the next quarter, the next client, the next brief, like constantly chasing something so like close in, and the idea of a long-term vision, being at the forefront of like the next revolution and thinking about what that might be. the power of like the 7 well-being goals. Like it's making me think like what could these goals be for our industry? Like how might we collectively co-create those? Because although we probably can't set them in law, we probably can do something with them that makes people like have to pay attention to them, which I think was really powerful. I love the quote that you shared. So think about the big things while you're doing small things, so that all the small things go in the right direction. Like for me, that's like, that, and thinking about the Horizon 3 Horizon model really connects. For me, we talk a lot about 3 horizons in the Good Life 2030 project, but this idea that sort of Horizon 1 is like where we're going at the moment, and like lots of things are not fit for the future, but the idea of Horizon 3 and where we want to be. And you sort of talked about how having the 7 clear goals, you know, helps you, and the fact they're in law helps you know where you're going. And then it means that when you're looking at the Horizon 2 things, you can be like, are they heading in that direction, or take us back? And the 5 ways of working, again, like I was sort of thinking about this from an industry point of view, like, you know, long-term prevention, like stopping things from getting worse, integration, collaboration and involvement. And just finally the abominable no men, I could literally list them, and the passive procrastinators, I could list those too in a spreadsheet quite easily. And I think you're right. I think the thing that we are always most excited about is the frustrated champions, which are the people on this call and the people who come to our events and summits and the people who get involved in the projects, and trying to work out how we give them more power is part of what we are trying to do. So those were just a few reflections, but really interested in everyone else's questions, so I'll stop talking now and pass over to Kerry.
Kerry, you're good. You've prepped and primed, Kerry.
Good. So many amazing questions. I think just testament to a super broad and just the range of that presentation. It was fantastic. So lots of questions just around the process for this policy change work, Sophie. So looking at how you took the research landscape and decided what things would make things worse for future generations. So the use of studies, public data to make estimates that far into the future and predictions, and just thinking about what helped you choose those areas to focus on. You touched on this a bit, but perhaps you could just expand.
So in terms of the goals, they very much came from the public dialogue. At the same time, the UN Sustainable Development Goals was in development. That was just a bit of serendipity. So we looked at what was going on at a global level, and we also looked at the kind of, you know, long-term data and trends around, you know, and particular trajectories that Wales was on. That I guess the challenge with data is, one, we've tended to, you know, not necessarily always measure the stuff that actually we need to get measured. So, for example, one of the things that was introduced just around the time that we were legislating was like a national survey for Wales. So to get to some of those like softer things, like, so it asks questions like, you know, have you volunteered recently? Is there a sense of community in your area? Those kind of softer things, whereas previously we'd probably been more focused on very sort of, you know, hard, you know, data-driven measures. I heard this quote recently, which was something like, people's stories are data with soul. And that's just like, I think that's kind of, you know, where we've tried to be. And certainly in my role as commissioner, I very much sort of, you know, directed people in that way to, you know, it's just as important to be hearing those stories as well as looking at the data. We did another layer of that then. So when I became commissioner, and the new commissioner now, Derek Walker, is doing a similar piece. So to help me to set my priorities, because you can see that those goals are like all encompassing. So where do you start with them? So the next layer of questions, I suppose, that I posed to the people of Wales was, what are the policy areas, if we get them right, would make the biggest contribution to each one of those wellbeing goals? Now, that was quite interesting because, you know, so what came out of those were housing, planning and transport, and then jobs and skills for the future, better ways of keeping people well, and tackling childhood adversities. Now, I had quite a bit of pushback there, because why haven't you got a priority on climate change? So it's a fair pushback. But the answer to that is climate change kind of runs through all of those. Jobs and skills for the future, about green jobs and how are we creating those jobs, and upskilling our kids to go into them. Housing, how we build our houses, critical to our emissions targets. Likewise, in terms of transport. Energy was an initial priority, but other people were doing work. So really what we were trying to look at are getting out of the silo, just going, I'm looking at climate change and saying, where does climate change happen, or what causes climate change? And it's through all of these different elements.
Thank you. That added so much colour to what is a very long process within getting to those wellbeing goals, and then the impact and the policies that relate to them. A lot of people are asking about you touched on some of those categories, which are wonderful. So frustrated champions, abominable nomans. What were the barriers that you saw in engaging with not just government ministers and bodies, but in your work now, corporations, business leaders, those that aren't sort of respectfully taking on your recommendations? How do you deal with those groups? Do you have any recommendations for those that are still in that short-term mindset? So yeah, Claire, Paul, lots of people interested in that. Donald.
So I think that there's a kind of few different tactics, I suppose, we've deployed. So it depends who you're speaking to. If you're speaking to the finance people or the lawyers, waving the law at them is actually quite helpful. If you don't have a law, then obviously that's a bit more difficult. There's something about going in on the agendas that press people's buttons. So, for example, in that issue on the road, it was presented, both in terms of most of the political arguments and the kind of media presentation. It's it's the environmental NGOs versus the CBI, and it's this big kind of clash of environment versus economy and so on. Actually, the stuff that really played out was, you claim to be a government of social justice. Are you really going to spend the entire of the government's borrowing capacity on building something which has no benefit to the 25% poorest people in our communities? Now, that's not usually an argument that kind of plays out in those sorts of issues, but there's something there around using those, that holistic kind of framework to work out where, to sort of look holistically across them and work out where, what's going to press particular buttons. Some of the things that certainly we've seen, if any of you have ever worked in the public sector, you will know the public sector, they love writing a bloody good strategy, and they'll use all the right words for stuff, and they won't actually change anything that they do. So we definitely saw that at the beginning, and I think there was a bit of a kind of journey that I was going on as commissioner to say, well done for writing a nice strategy. Now you actually have to do something different. And they were like, what do you mean we need to do something different? We've gone through the bureaucracy. That's what we do in the public sector. No, you now actually need to do something different. And then it was connecting those organisations with the frustrated champions who were already starting to do something different, connecting them with organisations outside who were helping them, identifying those people, in organisations who were going to be the real sort of champions and getting behind them. There's definitely something, if you're stuck in this world of like you being a frustrated champion and you're trying to drive change in your organisation, there's definitely something about finding a tribe and building a movement within your organisation of people who are going to kind of come behind you. And there's definitely something about identifying those people in leadership positions and what is the thing that presses their button. Often, and I hear this all the time across every part of the world that I go to, CEOs saying, my kids are challenging me on that, or my grandkids are challenging me on that. And it sort of is we almost sort of dismiss it, but actually these people are, they're human, aren't they? And that's the stuff that often kind of sticks with them. So utilize that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely hear that at Purpose Disruptors too. 3 people have asked around topics concerning citizens, so the use of Citizens Assemblies stepping up where government haven't. What are your thoughts on how the enthusiasm of citizens wanting to have more of an active role rather than as passive consumers in this process? And have you worked with Citizens Assemblies in the past?
Yeah, and there's quite a few that have kind of popped up either at a kind of local level. So there was like Gwent, which is sort of, you know, Newport, Monmouthshire area, Gwent Citizens Panel on climate, which is now actually informing the whole strategy for Gwent at that local level. There was a nationwide citizen assembly looking at, we actually had parallel legislation going through at the same time as the Future Generations Act, called the Social Services and Wellbeing Bill, which probably takes the Future Generations Act principles, which is at a societal level, and kind of puts that into an individualized thing in terms of social care and how do we look after people. And there was a massive citizens panel around that, which has resulted in quite a number of policy changes. We've got a youth parliament in Wales, and we've lowered the voting age to 16, which also helps. So there's lots kind of going on in that space. My view on it, however, is that all of that is important, but you also need to be infiltrating the system. So we've put in place some things to do that. So some of the proposals I've made, things like a real life fast track. So you get this fast track in the civil service, which tends to be your Oxbridge graduates, you know, don't really have a problem with Oxbridge graduates, except there's far too many of them making decisions in public policy and public services. Actually, why shouldn't we have the young care leaver working in government as the policy lead on the care system? And why shouldn't we fast track that person and their expertise and knowledge? We need, there's things that we've done around kind of job swap and secondment. So opening up government to bring in expertise. So we've got something called a social partnership bill going through at the moment, which is about partnership between government, trade unions and business, and people who've been seconded in from the trade union movement to lead the development of that legislation. Some other things that we've done, which has been really powerful, reverse mentoring. So I set up something called the Future Leaders Academy, 2 cohorts, 50 young leaders from across Wales, a whole range of different sectors. So people who are in engineering, we've got some young care leavers there, we've got people who are young entrepreneurs, and so on and so on. They go through an intensive programme around what does leading within the realms of the Future Generations Act look like, and how can they take that into their organisations. But then one of the most powerful things that we did with them is they became mentors to existing chief executives. So we have young leaders who have reverse mentored have mentored the permanent secretary of the Welsh Government Civil Service, the chief executive of the Football Association, which then led to the development of their sustainability plan. I bumped into the chief exec of the Ports Authority a couple of months back, who told me that even though the programme had finished, his young mentor was so effective that he's actually paying her to continue to be his mentor. And that power of young people eyeballing existing leaders and going, you're doing what? Why are you doing that? How is that playing out for our generation? Have you considered climate anxiety? Have you considered, the way in which we use digital and so on? In that one-to-one sort of safe space is really impactful.
Oh, thanks so much, Sophie. I wish we could continue talking all evening. I'm afraid we only have time for one more question, but then I know we're going to open it up for sort of wider discussion time. So a few questions related, just reflections at the end of a brilliant 7-year term. So knowing what you know now, I guess asking a Future Generations Commissioner to look back into the past. So at the start, where would you have started, knowing what you know now?
So I mean, I think this is like an honest sort of vulnerability here. When I started the job, I was like, shit, I'm not responsible for the whole Future Generations of Wales. I've got to transform the way in which we've been doing things. And I had sleepless nights going, oh my God, how are we going to get them to do this? And I had in my draft strategy, we're going to build a movement. That's what we're going to do. We're going to build a movement. We're going to get other people excited and on board, and we're going to say this is our mission, to have these sort of champions everywhere and so on. And I actually took it out of the strategy because I was like, oh, what does it mean? How are we going to do that? It's like, and I've got all these statutory duties that I've got to meet. I've got to monitor and assess this plan and that plan and so on and so on. So didn't put it in the strategy, but actually I ended up doing it anyway. And that was the most impactful thing that we did, building a movement around this, inspiring people behind those goals. making it not boring public sector bureaucratic stuff where people are going to tick boxes and commissioners are going to issue reports that nobody reads, but actually getting people excited. And that was a bit of a kind of, I think not putting in our initial strategy, it's because I was too nervous about how we would deliver that and would I be meeting the statutory duties. And then as I got into my stride, it was like, balls to the statutory duties, we're going to do the things that makes the biggest impact. And I think that has kind of been its success. There's people now who are not covered by the Act, but who knock our door going, how can we do it? Big private sector organisations in Wales who love it. And the power of like the Welsh football team, the chief exec of the FAW is like a massive fan, telling Wales and telling the government, we're doing this, you need to keep up with us. That's hugely powerful, more powerful than any stick a commissioner could shake at people.
Amazing. Brilliant answers, Sophie. Thank you. I'm like fully inspired and now want to like run out into the streets and start building even more of a movement than we are at Purpose Disruptors. Lisa, are you sort of introducing this next section? So basically I'll sort of give a bit of an overview. So we, in this last 10 minutes really, because we've only got 15 minutes left of the session and we'll do a little wrap at the end, but we really just wanted to sort of invite people to have a think about a couple of reflections as to sort of like, given everything that we've heard now, what does that mean for advertising, marketing, comms? What does that mean for our day-to-day roles? So Lisa, I don't know if you wanted to step in and sort of like give anything on the questions that we were going to pose.
Yeah, I can do. I think you sort of covered it, Amy. Oh, hang on.
Yeah, sorry, that was.
Hear me now? I think you kind of covered it, but I think hearing what we've just heard, and the last question was maybe my favorite one, which is actually like what actually was the difference that made the difference? Like what was the thing, what were the things that you did that made this all work? And so I think the question it would be good to get people to just reflect on is, what could this mean for our industry? So maybe the question is, what would need to change for advertising to serve future generations? What would we need to do? What would we need to do differently? I don't know if someone can drop that question in the chat. And then Amy, I don't know whether you want people to put their hands up and respond as a group, or it might be nice to hear some voices if we've got time.
Yeah, we've got 10 minutes and I think it would be lovely to, I know sort of if anyone's feeling brave, obviously, we can take a moment to just sort of sit with that question for a second. But yeah, if anyone's got any initial thoughts on that, do raise your hand and then, feel free to sort of speak into the space and share your thoughts really.
Everyone feeling a bit shy tonight? There's normally some people on this call who want to ask questions. You know who you are. Maybe we'll take a minute to just reflect on the question and then see whether anybody has thoughts.
I saw Peppo, did you raise your hand there?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was looking for the hand to raise it up. I was just wondering if Sophie, have you approached advertising industry in Wales or in UK? Because it's kind of a circle. Because how much can advertising industry change if clients don't change? How much can clients change approaching consumers if we as consumers don't change? So is there anything you've learned about this that could help us?
So no, so I haven't done any work directly, but I definitely see the bigger picture there. I mean, and actually in conversation with Purpose Disruptors at the moment around the sort of potential for, could there be a Future Generations Act for the UK? How might you guys be able to turn your, skills, talents, capacity, whatever it might be, to help with that? But I think that, I suppose what we've done in Wales is kind of, started from the government, built a kind of movement outside, and there are things now. So, Wales don't have, we don't have devolved powers around kind of advertising regulations or anything like that. Where we are seeing the change with the private sector, it was initially coming through, if you want to do business in the public sector in Wales, you're going to start seeing requirements on the Future Generations Act coming through in your tenders, and that is actually coming through into the advertising tenders, as well as all tenders coming from the public sector in Wales. And then so initially private sector was sort of engaged through that route. Then they started waking up, well, one, we're going to have to do this anyway. Two, actually, now we've worked out what it is, it actually seems quite sensible, and we'd like to sort of, work out how we could do more. Three, we like the fact that we can be part of a Team Wales approach to all of this. Now, there is something, I suppose, about Wales being a small nation, and it's kind of a bit easier to do in that regard, but you've got to start somewhere. And I think what we've seen is that things just start flowing from that, and this kind of, there's just a shift in the kind of mindset of how we do business in Wales. So, and that is starting to permeate into these, other areas beyond the public sector that the Act kind of, covers.
Thanks so much, Sophie. That answers your question, Pepper. That's great. So the question was, what would need to change for advertising to serve future generations? I can see that Paul Hackett, you've got your hand up. Did you have some thoughts?
Lisa, good day, and Sophie, thank you so very much. I apologise that there's no video image. I assure you that you're not missing very much. It's just that we're part of a small collaborative with UCLH, and we're actually occupying one of their meeting rooms at the moment, and the protocol is no pictures, no images. But one of the things I wanted to very quickly just pose for other people's critique and consideration. I certainly wouldn't be so presumptuous as to formally answer the question that you asked, Lisa, but something that's been going on in the collaboration and the work that we've been doing in working with doctors, clinicians, and medical researchers to solve commercial challenges, but through a well-being driven lens. We talk to organisations in terms of asking them what might they achieve were their organisation and brands to be well-being driven, and part of that discussion revolves around how might it benefit the organisation most for them to have a positive well-being impact on either colleagues, customers, or wider community. So trying to make that as normal a business best practice as you might sustainability, diversity, and gender equality, and the rest. There is most definitely, we've had a couple of meetings with Moody's, the credit agency. There is most definitely a growing force and momentum, they say, from the investment community, where they wish to understand better how an organisation or a brand or a service is genuinely living up to well-being driven criteria as much as they might sustainability and the rest. So I think you're quite right, it has to come from many directions, but I think this notion of just asking, one CEO we had a conversation with, and we said, it might sound quite glib, but we said that in the 50s and 60s, it was very, very common for advertising agencies to have an in-house psychologist. 70 years later, we're thinking maybe there's opportunity to have some kind of well-being impact strategist as part of that overall advisory team. That was all. So, sorry, I don't mean to hog the conversation. I'm rambling on, but thank you ever so much for letting me share that thought.
No, that's amazing. I love that idea. I love the idea of a kind of psychologist, well-being kind of impact expert in-house. That's great. And I think one of the things that you talked about, Sophie, kind of tenders, and like it's starting to come through within the sort of the core of the industry and the institutional like way in which the industry works, we're definitely starting to see that. We're definitely starting to see how people are starting to ask questions, clients and brands are starting to ask questions of agencies around kind of, you know, what they're doing around their kind of climate commitments and plans. And we're seeing that on a sort of broader scale. Amy, I don't know if you want to touch on anything about investment community as well.
Yeah, so we literally just shared an advertised emissions update yesterday, newsletter. So I don't know if you might be registered for the Purpose Disruptors newsletter, but there's also, you've got a bucket of people who get advertised emissions specific comms. But essentially we were approached, so advertised emissions is our report which calculates the impact of the advertising industry in terms of emissions, and we were approached by people who were advising investor communities, basically saying, we're digging into the impact now that advertising has in terms of carbon, and we want to really closely look at the measurement side of things. And we have identified that a lot of, or nearly all organizations aren't taking into consideration their advertised emissions, so they're not being truthful, and so we will be more, there's likely to be more scrutiny on this. So I think it's just something that's very interesting, you know, that's kind of, yeah, that we're seeing all of these different inputs kind of coalesce. And I think it's going to essentially, it's, yeah, increased implied pressure, basically, that will be hopefully unavoidable for people to take notice of.
Great, thank you. Well, I think that's probably what we've got time for in terms of sort of people's reflections on that. Obviously, I'll let Amy do sort of a bit more of a wrap up in a minute, but I think the kind of connection between the sort of 3 horizons model, the future thinking, the need to kind of, you know, think more clearly about what the sort of direction of travel is, what the goals are that we hold for the future, sort of feeds, I guess, really strongly into our Good Life 2030 project. So if you found kind of, you know, this area and this work, you know, really fascinating and want to think about, be involved in more sort of how we might do this in our industry, then we can share the website for that. And we've also just developed a sort of imagination toolkit, which you can kind of go on an imagination journey. And yes, we are talking to Sophie about how we as purpose disruptors and with sort of network within our industry might help as we approach next election, and how we might help make the Future Generation Act a UK-wide thing. So yeah, we'll need lots of collaborators on that. So watch this space, and I'll pass back over to Amy to close up.
Yeah, so thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, round of applause to Sophie. Amazing, amazing, amazing. Lots of inspiration. This talk will be up online next week, probably. So yeah, share it with your folks, friends. And yeah, I hope you've, you know, enjoyed your time and been inspired. So I would just say, please sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat now. So that is really the best way to kind of stay up to date with everything Purpose Disruptors related. We send an update out every month, and also follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram and Twitter. And yeah, and then final plug. I know we've thrown a few things at you, but if you haven't already and you're part of an agency and you need training, sign up to Change the Brief Alliance. It is amazing, and here is a link and to find out more. So yeah, it's the industry standard sustainability training. It is the essential first step on this journey, so please do check it out. And final thing is, if you're based in London, we will have a pub gathering last Tuesday of June. So we'll be sending out info on that. But yeah, another opportunity to kind of collectively come together, plot, engage, think about ways in which we can transform the advertising industry. So that is all from me and the team. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been amazing. And goodbye. Have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Sophie.